Failed States, the Abuse of Power, and the Assault on Democracy, 2006, by Noam Chomsky, critiques American foreign policy and its role in undermining democracy, both domestically and internationally. Chomsky argues that the United States exhibits many of the characteristics of a failed state, including a lack of accountability, the erosion of democratic principles, and the reliance on violence and coercion to maintain global dominance. He examines the ways in which American policies have not only harmed other nations, but have also contributed to the deterioration of its own democratic institutions. Chomsky begins by explaining the concept of a failed state. According to him, a failed state is one that cannot protect its citizens, lacks democratic legitimacy, and frequently resorts to violence to achieve its objectives. These states also disregard international law and often undermine global stability. Although the term is typically used to describe countries in the global South, Chomsky provocatively applies it to the United States. He argues that while America is a powerful nation, it meets many of the criteria for a failed state. Chomsky cites the American government's frequent violations of international law, its failure to address pressing social and economic problems, and its erosion of civil liberties, as evidence that it is heading in the direction of state failure. A central theme in failed states is the Americas' consistent disregard for international law. Chomsky provides numerous examples of how America has violated international norms, often with impunity. He highlights the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 as a blatant breach of international law, as it was carried out without the approval of the United Nations and based on false pretenses about weapons of mass destruction. Chomsky also discusses the Americas' history of supporting military coups and authoritarian regimes around the world, particularly in Latin America. He argues that these actions have destabilized entire regions and resulted in significant human suffering, all in the name of protecting American economic and geopolitical interests. The Americas' use of torture, extrajudicial killings, and indefinite detention in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks is another focus of Chomsky's critique. He contends that these practices not only violate international law, but also undermine the moral authority of America, making it more difficult for the country to claim a legitimate role as a global leader in human rights and democracy. Chomsky is deeply concerned with the state of democracy in America, arguing that it has been steadily eroded by the concentration of power in the hands of political and corporate elites. He contends that while the Americas claims to be a democracy, its political system is increasingly dominated by wealthy interests that have little regard for the needs and concerns of ordinary citizens. Chomsky points to the influence of money in politics as a major factor in the decline of American democracy. He explains how campaign finance laws, lobbying, and corporate donations have created a system where politicians are more accountable to wealthy donors than to their constituents. This, he argues, leads to policies that benefit the rich at the expense of the poor and the middle class. Moreover, Chomsky critiques the two-party system in America, which he believes offers only superficial differences between the Democratic and Republican parties. According to Chomsky, Both parties are beholden to corporate interests and largely agree on key issues, such as foreign policy and economic deregulation. This lack of meaningful political alternatives, he argues, contributes to widespread voter apathy and disengagement from the political process. Chomsky examines the War on Terror as a prime example of American imperial ambitions and its role in perpetuating global instability. He argues that America has used the War on Terror as a pretext to expand its military presence around the world, particularly in the Middle East. Chomsky contends that the real goals of the War on Terror are not about defeating terrorism, but rather about maintaining control over strategically important regions and resources, especially oil. Chomsky is highly critical of American invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, which he views as unnecessary and counterproductive. He argues that these wars have led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, the displacement of millions, and the creation of new generations of terrorists. Instead of addressing the root causes of terrorism, such as poverty, political repression, and U.S. support for authoritarian regimes, the War on Terror has exacerbated global tensions and contributed to widespread anti-American sentiment. Chomsky also highlights the role of America in undermining democracy abroad. He argues that the U.S. frequently supports authoritarian regimes as long as they serve American interests. This is especially evident in the Middle East, where America has long-standing alliances with dictatorships like Saudi Arabia. Chomsky points out the hypocrisy of American foreign policy, which claims to promote democracy while simultaneously backing regimes that suppress their own people. While much of Chomsky's focus is on American foreign policy, he also examines the domestic impact of imperial ambitions. He argues that the pursuit of global dominance has come at a high cost to American society, particularly in terms of civil liberties and social welfare. Chomsky discusses how the War on Terror has led to the erosion of civil liberties in America, citing the Patriot Act, increased surveillance, and the expansion of executive power as examples. He argues that these measures, justified in the name of national security, have resulted in a significant loss of privacy and freedom for American citizens. Chomsky warns that this trend towards authoritarianism is a hallmark of failed states, where governments prioritize security and control over democratic principles. He also critiques the way in which military spending has drained resources from essential domestic programs. Chomsky points out that America spends more on its military than the next several countries combined, yet fails to provide basic services like universal healthcare, affordable education, and a robust social safety net. This, he argues, reflects the priorities of a state more concerned with global domination than with the well-being of its own people. Chomsky draws attention to the environmental crisis as another area where America is failing its citizens and the world. He argues that the American government's refusal to take meaningful action on climate change is a clear example of its disregard for the future. Chomsky critiques the influence of powerful corporate interests, particularly in the fossil fuel industry, which have blocked efforts to reduce carbon emissions and transition to renewable energy sources. He connects the environmental crisis to the broader theme of state failure, arguing that a government that prioritizes short-term profits over the long-term survival of its people is failing in its most basic responsibilities. Chomsky warns that the continued failure to address climate change could have catastrophic consequences for both the U.S. and the global community, a recurring theme in Chomsky's work, including failed states, is the role of the media in supporting the status quo. Chomsky argues that the mainstream media in America plays a crucial role in shaping public opinion to align with the interests of the political and corporate elite. He critiques the media for its failure to provide critical analysis of American foreign policy and for its tendency to marginalize dissenting voices. Chomsky refers to this process as the manufacturing of consent, where the media presents a narrow range of acceptable opinions, often framing America's actions as necessary and benevolent. This, he argues, helps to maintain public support for policies that are harmful to both America and the world. By limiting the scope of debate, the media prevents a genuine discussion of alternatives to imperialism and neoliberalism. In the final sections of Failed States, Chomsky offers some hope for resistance. He emphasizes the importance of grassroots movements and public activism in challenging the policies that contribute to state failure. Chomsky argues that meaningful change will not come from political elites, but from ordinary people organizing to demand a more just and democratic society. He highlights the role of social movements in the past, such as the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War protests, and the anti-globalization movement, as examples of how citizens can successfully challenge the power structure. Chomsky calls for a renewed commitment to activism and solidarity, both within America and globally, to address the challenges of imperialism, inequality, and environmental destruction.